Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Echo leaf blower. This was given to the channel by Ken of Ken's Small Engine and looks to be in really good condition. You know, it is complete, but there is one minor little problem. This machine actually belonged to one of Ken's customers, and unfortunately, the engine was straight gassed. This is a two-stroke engine. It needs oil in the fuel, or else the engine is gonna lock up. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. So the customer was hoping that Ken could fix it, which he could. The problem is, once you start to add up the price, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. The OEM parts plus Ken's time, this would likely be a $300 bill to get this repaired. So the customer declined getting it fixed and gave it to Ken. Anyway, if you're gonna do the work yourself, then this becomes much more repairable. So my hope today is that we can put a new top end on this engine and get this up and running again. So let me get you set up a little bit better and to get going on this. And just to show you the current state of the engine, it is locked solid. And that's a problem because if we're going to rebuild this, we at a minimum need a new cylinder and a new piston. And we can't get the cylinder off if the piston and the cylinder are one. So we do need to get the engine to rotate before taking this apart. So I am going to start just by peeling some of the layers. I want to get a wrench on the flywheel nut, get some oil down on the cylinder, and see if we can't get some movement out of this engine. So let's start just by getting the carburetor off. And I guess another risk here in rebuilding this is that I don't know how long ago this happened. So is the carb still good? Or are we going to have to rebuild that too? And unfortunately, we're not going to know until we fix the big problem here. Yeah, I was kind of hoping for a flywheel nut here, but that's not quite what we have. Anyway, we'll make do. I think for now I'm going to get a little bit of Marvel Mystery Oil down there, and then we'll put a wrench on this and see if we can get the engine to budge. Okay, good. Can't quite make it all the way. We're actually kind of stuck again. But the fact that it moves at all is a good thing. So right there, that actually is top dead center because I can see the Marvel Mystery Oil coming out. So we want to rotate this ideally 180 degrees to get this to the bottom. And that is a hard stop. And we're not even halfway to where we need to be. So let's see if we can push through it. Beautiful. It's hard to see, but you can kind of see the far cylinder wall. And if I rotate the engine, you'll be able to see the side of the piston, which is horribly scored. So yeah, the piston is done for sure. I would say likely the cylinder is as well. So I'm hoping I can get the cylinder off without having to disassemble the fan side of things. Kind of depends on whether this piece comes out or not. Which it does. And then the other obstacle we might have is the intake. This one's kind of unique. We have an intake over here, and then we also have one on the far side. So this tube right here just connects the carburetor and distributes it on both sides. But I think if we just pull the bolts for the jug, I'm pretty sure we can pull the jug off with the intake attached. Yeah, it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get that one out. So I'm thinking if we can maybe put something on each side, just holding the cylinder up, and then crank down. You know, hopefully that'll give us enough leverage to pull the piston out of there. So it looks like the bottom end survived. Everything rotates without issue. And there is 0 up and down play on the connecting rod, and just a little bit side to side, which is perfectly normal. So the bottom end, I think it's good. Well, the piston surprisingly looks halfway decent on the intake side. You know, there is some vertical scoring, but that actually cannot be felt. But if you turn it over to the exhaust side, that tells a very different story. There is some severe scoring that can definitely be felt, and the ring, it's stuck, and it's also damaged. So at a minimum, we do need a new piston. The jug, though, surprisingly looks a lot better than I thought it was going to. You know, the intake ports and pretty much everything in between looks and feels quite smooth. But again, on the exhaust side, which is over here, a little bit harder to show you, but you know, there is scoring all around that exhaust port. You know, that can be seen and felt. So, you know, there are things we could do to try to clean this up and reuse this jug, but I'm thinking the best thing here is to just get a new piston as well as a new cylinder. Well, it's a few days later, and the new top end kit arrived. So let's get it out of the box, make sure we have exactly what we need. Okay, good. We do have some new gaskets. Looks like some tubes for the intake manifold, so likely we have a new one of those as well. This here should be the new jug. And a base gasket. Then we have a few more boxes here. I'm thinking this one's probably the cylinder. It is. We've also got a new roller bearing, new wrist pin, as well as rings. And these boxes here, I think, yeah, just more intake manifold parts. So let's start with the piston. We'll get that assembled, get that installed, and then we'll move on to the jug. All right, so we've got the new piston. And just take note, when you do install it, the arrow should point toward the exhaust. Before we can install it, though, we do need to get the rings installed. And I'm actually going to install one of these circlips because we're not going to have access to it on the side closest to the blower. First things first, let's just double check the ring gap. That's an important step you don't want to skip. Now, being that this is a kit, and an OEM kit at that, I wouldn't expect that we're going to have a problem here, but it is good to check, because if the gap is too tight, then you're going to destroy your engine. In this case, I did measure the bore just to get a rough idea where we're at, and it comes in at about 1.7 inches, and a good rule of thumb is 0.04 of an inch for every inch of bore. So I would expect the gap to be at least 7 thousandths. And yeah, actually it fits in there nice and snug. So I think the top ring, or whatever ring this is perfectly fine. Let's check the other ring. And same feeler gauge, 7 thousandths. Yeah, and that one fits too. It's a snug fit, but it does fit. So I think we're okay with that gap. I took a pretty good look at these rings just to make sure there wasn't a difference as far as what position they go in. And as far as I can tell, these rings, they are identical. There's no taper, and the thickness is the same on both. So we'll just pick one and install it on the bottom here. Now, this locating pin here, this is where the ring gap should be. And actually, that is a pretty big clue as far as which side is up, because if you install it upside down, it's not going to go around that locating pin correctly. So that tells us that this side is facing up. All right, that one's in. And I'm just going to oil this up with some two-stroke oil. Doesn't have to be two-stroke oil, but you don't want it to be dry. And we'll do the same thing here where the wrist pin goes. And we'll oil these up too just before we install it. Now the hard thing here is that we do have these washers. They actually go on either side of the wrist pin. So it's going to make this installation a little bit more tricky. So I'm actually going to start just by cleaning the mating surface off. It'll probably be easier to do it now than once the piston's installed. All right, let's give this a try. I've got the wrist pin started and one of the washers in place. So we'll get the piston installed, the wrist pin pushed most of the way through, and then we'll try to fish the other washer up before pushing it the rest of the way. Okay. And there's a good chance I'm going to drop the washer at least once. So we'll put a towel here to hopefully catch it. There we go. As far as the cylinder goes, we do have to do some of this assembly now because this side, it's right up against the blower. So we're not going to have access to attach this later. So I'm going to install both these side intakes, and they are numbered. This one has a number 2 right there, and the other one has a number 1. So right now it is the number 2 side facing up. So we need to install this one along with a gasket. And then we'll flip it over and do the same for the other side. So the bottom of this, it is tapered, so it's going to help with the rings going on, but you do need to make sure they stay where they need to, where the locating pin is. Otherwise, the rings aren't going to compress properly. I'm thinking the next move here is just to hold this kind of loosely in place, and we'll get these boots on. You know, these are the last pieces that came with the top end kit. So everything else after this will be used parts. I can see a bit of light coming through those reeds. So, yeah, they should probably be replaced. I didn't realize that this saw had reeds. But one trick we might be able to do is to flip them. So let me get this old gasket off. We'll try that. See if it makes a better seal. And no, unfortunately, we can't flip these reeds. It looks like it's keyed on this side. The interesting thing, though, is that with that metal plate off, the reeds seem to sit properly. You know, they are nice and flat. Let's shine the light in there just to make sure. And yeah, there's no light shining through. So yeah, that seems a little bit odd that this plate is pushing those reeds open. I'm not sure if that's a feature or a flaw. I'm leaning towards flaw, but let's try it like this, and if it ends up not working, we might need to buy a new metal plate. So let me spend a second, just clean off the rest of this gasket material, and then we'll get this installed on the new cylinder. Yeah, I did order a new plug. It's not here yet. We might end up testing with this one, but for now, just want to plug the hole so that when I secure this, I don't accidentally drop the screws down into the engine. And theoretically, that is it. This machine should now run. That said, though, this was straight gassed, and I don't know for sure if the tank was drained out. I did take a look in here earlier, and it looks to be empty, but it's a pretty deep tank. So let's just tip it over, make sure it is empty, and then we'll add some fresh two-stroke fuel. I kind of wish there was some fuel in that tank, because without it, there is no direct evidence of what happened here. All I know is that I was told it was straight gassed. And of course, the engine failed. So there are other reasons that would cause the damage that we saw. So when we get it started, we're going to have to pay attention and just make sure things are running right. Because the last thing I want to do is burn up the new top end. That said, though, we do have one important piece of evidence, which is the piston. The way it failed tells me that the engine was overheated, And of course, a lack of oil would be a good reason for overheating. But there are other reasons. You know, the cooling fins could be clogged. The engine could be running too fast or under a very heavy load for a long time. So the other thing you can do is look at the underside, and if it was a lack of oil, then the underside would be dry. And that's what I'm seeing here. It's not covered in oil. So I think it likely was just run with the wrong fuel. So let's get the right fuel in there and try to start it. Okay, good. The purge bulb, it filled up with fuel. So I just turned the ignition on, give it a little bit of throttle, and set the choke to on. I don't know if I caught that on camera, but I just blew out a big nest or something. There's pieces kind of everywhere. So, yeah, hopefully that's all that was in there. Anyway, the engine, it sounded good, although it did stall out once I turned the choke off and let it throttle down. So I'm going to try to restart it, see if this tube is clear, and hopefully this time it idles a little bit longer. All right, let's try this again. Yeah, it's having trouble idling. Now it won't start. Yeah, we're still full of fuel. Yeah, I think we might have some carb issues here. And I did not order a rebuild kit, of course. So we might need to get one of those. Let's try choke. Yeah, I think we do have carb issues here. Now, we can run it pretty well at medium to high speed with the choke off, but it will not idle. So that could definitely be a carb issue. You know, being though that this is two-stroke, it could be an air leak as well, either in the crankcase or potentially a crank seal. So I think the easiest thing to do would be to eliminate the carb as a possibility. And there is a low-speed needle we can adjust. Unfortunately, I don't have the right tool to make that adjustment, so I'm going to have to get that ordered up. You know, likely I'll get a rebuild kit as well. And after going through the carb, if it still runs poorly, I think we're going to have to turn our attention to looking for a leak. Well, it's been a couple weeks, and the rebuild kit showed up today. So I did end up pulling the carb off the machine. You know, originally I was going to try to tune that pilot needle. So I had to order a specialized tool because the single D that I had was way too large. So I went online and saw a few. You know, some were called small d, others tiny d, and some micro d, and I kind of assumed they were all the same. So I ordered the small d, and unfortunately, it's too big. It will not fit in there. So adjusting that needle, it is not an option, at least right now. You know, theoretically, it's adjusted perfectly from the factory, so my hope is if we clean it up and put a rebuild kit in it, that it will run correctly. And I guess my only concern is that, you know, to clean this properly, we would ideally pull these needles out to clean those passages. So even if we clean this and rebuild it, it still may not run right until we get the proper tool. But, you know, let's proceed with what we have. We'll try it out, and with any luck, we'll be back in business. So this is coming apart pretty easily. There is a little bit of debris in here, nothing too bad. We do have a spring, so let's not lose that. You know, as far as this sandwich goes, let's take it apart, just taking note of where everything goes. So what's at the purge bulb aside? Yeah, so far things are looking pretty clean. Although that gasket seemed like it was ripped, so I would say someone was in here before, and potentially that's the issue. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of junk. You know, that screen, it is clear. Yeah, a little bit of junk down here. Not too bad, though. Yeah, and you can see a little bit of debris right there, too. So, yeah, I mean, this carb, I would say there's no smoking gun. But definitely a bit of debris. So, I'm going to, I think, get the needle out. You know, we'll soak these parts in the ultrasonic, clean off all the old gasket material, and we'll get this back together, and hopefully it runs a little bit better. Yikes. That little screw should not be that tight. Well, I'm going to try a little bit of heat on that because it is not coming out. And I do not want to strip that. Oh boy. All right, on second thought, I'm going to leave this alone. You know, we don't have to replace every part. And that screw right there, it's not coming out. And I'm afraid I'm going to cause a problem if I keep going. So, with that in mind, let's just go through the rest of this. And fortunately, I didn't really find a problem or a blockage in this carburetor, so I'm not convinced that a rebuild kit is going to fix it. That said, though, before putting it in the ultrasonic, I wanted to study it and just understand how the fuel is getting to that low-speed circuit, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. So I've loosely put the sandwich back together. So starting at the top, you know, this is just the purge bulb. It does exactly what it sounds like. It purges the air from the carb, draws fuel in from the tank, and fills the carb with fuel. You know, we know this layer is working because we tested it earlier, and it's doing what it should. The next layer also is working because this is what allows fuel into the carb when needed. You know, this is actually a reservoir of fuel down here. And the needle and seat, that is opening and closing. So it's pulling fuel from the tank. When this reservoir is full, this diaphragm goes up and it no longer pushes the needle open. You know, as the fuel is consumed, this diaphragm goes down and pushes on that arm, you know, allowing fuel in, the reservoir fills up, and then it closes again. So we know this works because the high-speed circuit works fine. So that, I don't think, is the issue. The fuel that is delivered into the body up above comes down into this passage right here, and that feeds the lower part of the carb through that little hole, and it actually fills up this cavity where the V is. And this is what distributes the fuel to the high speed and the low speed circuit. You know, if I take the carb body right here, and if you look real close, you can see that V right there. So the fuel comes down and feeds into each of these ports. And those ports, that is where the low speed and the high speed needles come into play, because the further these are driven in, the more it restricts the flow through those ports. So, you know, assuming that these are adjusted right, then the correct amount of fuel will be delivered from, in this case, the high speed port over to this cavity where the emulsion tube is, into the throat of the carb. And on the low speed side, the fuel is fed in right there, metered by the needle, and ultimately comes out that large hole right there. And then these three little holes are connected to the throat of the carb. So that is the low speed circuit. Now I went through all these, and all these passages are clear. And the fact that the high speed ran tells me that we were getting fuel to this distribution area. So, if there is a blockage, it would have been from right here to right there. Or that needle is in too far. So yeah, I'm not holding my breath. I don't think a rebuild kit is going to fix this. I think we just need to adjust the needle, or maybe not even a carb problem. Anyway, enough talking. Let me soak this for a few minutes in the ultrasonic. We'll put it together and try it out. All right, let's see if I can get this back together properly. So we'll start kind of from the top down. So we'll get this diaphragm back in, the new one. And the next layer, we're going to have the check valves, which is these two right here. Okay, that should do it. So I'm going to get this bolted back on the machine, and we'll try it out. All right, let's give this a try. I've got the carb reinstalled. Now, I'm not too optimistic about this because the carb actually looked pretty good. So hopefully I didn't make it any worse. I'll give it a bit of throttle. Nope, can't do it. Well, unfortunately, rebuilding the carb had no effect. It's running the same way. The engine runs pretty well at mid to high speed, but it will not idle. It just falls on its face like it's not getting enough fuel. So yeah, the carburetor might still be the issue. If I could back out that low speed needle, that would tell me pretty quickly what's going on. Unfortunately, I can't. So I could order another tool and hope that it fits, but I'm thinking in this case, I might just order a clone carb. It'll be here in a few days. It can be returned if it's no good. And the best thing about it is that it's fully adjustable with just ordinary tools. So I'm going to get one of those ordered up and we'll try it out. So the carb kit showed up today, and it contains quite a bit of parts that, I'm not going to need in this case, including a spark plug, which I wouldn't use, likely. But what I will use is this air filter. It looks to be in decent shape. It's definitely better than the one that's on there. But the main reason why I got this kit was, of course, for the carburetor. Now, this carb, it had mixed reviews. And although it looks like the right part, and it's advertised for this machine, there is one big difference that everyone complained about. And that's where the throttle linkage connects. This plate, it's not compatible with this machine. So if we want to use this carburetor, we actually need to swap this plate with the OEM one. So I'm going to get the OEM carb off. We will do the quick swap, install the clone, and hopefully it idles. You know, if it doesn't, at least we do have adjustments that we can actually adjust. So we'll try to tune it, and hopefully this finally will run right. OEM carbs on the right, clone is on the left, and you can see they look nearly identical. So it seems to be a pretty good clone. Big exception, this plate right here. You can see on the OEM, it goes to the left, whereas the clone, it goes down and to the right. But the shafts, I think, are compatible. So let's try to get the OEM off. Hopefully that doesn't fight us, and we'll move it over. Now that feels like it wants to strip out, so let's just try it with some vice grips instead. Well. Yeah, I'm actually bending it, so maybe there's a little thread locker in there. Let me try heating it up, because that screw is not letting go. Look at that. So the whole reason this screw is so hard to take out is that it is serrated. So it essentially locks it into the plate. Yeah, that took a good 10 minutes or so to get out. Anyway, now that it's out, we do have other issues. You know, I tried fitting the OEM plate to the clone carb and found that it wouldn't fit. So after struggling for a bit, I took some measurements, and what I found is that on the sides that are flat, it actually measures 0.003 of an inch smaller than the clone. So yeah, that is a problem. You know, I've been looking around for a file that can get in there, and this is the smallest one I have, and it is too big. So instead, you know, I found this little Dremel bit, which surprisingly doesn't even fit in my Dremel. It's just too small. So I took that to the flats just for about 30 seconds, and we're almost to the point where it's going to fit. So I'm going to spend just a little bit more time opening that up, and I think we're ready to get it installed. Okay, good. It is keyed in place and is actually a pretty snug fit. Now I do have to reuse this screw. Even though it's chewed up, the threads are different from the OEM one. That said though, I think we can still use it. Let's try it out. Yeah, you know what? Although the clone filter is nice and clean, it's not a snug fit. So I am not going to use this filter. All right, let's give this a try. Carb primed up without issue, so we are full of fuel. Get the choke on and the ignition's on. Let's give this a try. And that's all it was, the carb, which is kind of surprising. After cleaning and rebuilding the OEM carb, the engine ran exactly the same. So I had almost resigned to the fact we must have an air leak somewhere in the crankcase. Thankfully, though, that is not the case because the clone although a little difficult to retrofit to this engine. I'm glad we did because it started on the second pull. It was idling perfectly. And the initial settings on both the needles are actually pretty good. So we might fine tune that a bit later, but for now, I think it's a good starting point. So let's finish this thing up. I did buy a new plug, so we'll get that installed. We'll get the tube reattached, and then I think we'll be ready to get this thing outside. So I know there's going to be some questions about this OEM carb, so I just pulled it apart again because I wanted to highlight something that I saw the first time I went through it. And it was something that I couldn't really do anything about due to the fact that I don't have the right tool. But as noted earlier, the fuel comes down to this point. These two holes right here, they share a common source of fuel. This one's the high-speed jet, or the high-speed circuit. So the fuel goes in there, comes out there, and on the low speed it goes in there and comes out there. And these are both metered by the needles. So if I put some carb spray in to the low-speed circuit, it will come out here, but not very fast. In fact, a lot of it just kind of sprays back instead of going through. So, yeah, that is an issue. There is a restriction, potentially the needle, maybe something else. But if I spray in it backwards, it actually flows a lot better going through the opposite way. So, yeah, is there an obstruction? I don't know. Is the needle in too far? I don't know. Without the right tool to get the needle out, I don't think we'll ever know. Well, it is bright and early, and it is a very cold morning. So this is going to be a good cold start. Now, the leaves, they may actually be frozen to the ground, so I'm not sure how productive we're going to be. But really, what I want to test here is the reliability of the machine. I've only had this running for about a minute at any given time, and really we need to get some heat into the engine, make sure the jetting is good, and that things continue to run well. So let me get this started. We'll let it warm up a bit, and then we'll put it to work. Well, this just performed flawlessly. It started first pull, had absolutely no issues idling, and ran great at high speed. It had no issues clearing the leaves. You know, as far as the jetting goes, if anything, I'd say it's a touch rich on the high side. But with 2 strokes, I'd rather be a little bit rich. You know, lean will burn up an engine, and as we saw with the original top end, it was running lean, and it burned up. Now, I am second guessing myself as far as why it burned up. You know, I was told it was straight gassed, and what we saw on the piston seemed to indicate that. But of course, once we got the machine up and running, we saw the OEM carb was having issues. It was not delivering enough fuel on that low speed circuit. So if the prior owner was running it like that, then that would have created a lean condition. You know, even though that OEM carb ran fine at medium to high speed, the low speed circuit always supplies fuel. So this engine for sure would have been running lean, and likely that is why the original top end burned up. Anyway, at the end of the day, we managed to save this from the trash. You know, I knew going into it that this wasn't going to make a lot of sense financially. You know, 2-stroke repairs, they are very hard to justify because the cost is often more than the worth of the machine. And in this case, this is not a commercial grade machine. You know, I can buy these used for about $200, and the OEM top end kit I used was $150. And I was hoping that would be the extent of my expense in this machine, but of course it wasn't. You know, I bought a rebuild kit for $20. I bought that adjustment tool for another $10. And of course we ended up buying the clone kit for $25. So I'm in this now for just over $200. So, you know, best case I would break even. You know, in retrospect, maybe using an aftermarket top end would have made this a little bit more worthwhile. But in my case, I don't plan on selling this, at least not right away. You know, I only have 2 leaf blowers. I have 3 kids, so I'm going to add another blower to the collection, and I will definitely get my money back on this one. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.